Hello. Today we're going to look at how Americans suffered during the Great Depression. Our learning objectives for this section is to explain how the Depression developed, to describe the human impact of the Great Depression, and to explain why the Dust Bowl was so devastating. The stock market collapse strained the resources of banks, and many failed, thus creating greater anxiety. In 1929, banks had little cash on hand and they were vulnerable to runs or a string of nervous depositors withdrawing money. Now, key in understanding this is understanding how banks operate. Banks operate on what we call a fractional reserve system. And what that means is that when you go and you deposit money into the bank, a bank doesn't necessarily keep all of your money. The bank keeps a small fraction of the deposits of all of their depositors, and they can loan out the rest for investments. This works because not everybody's withdrawing their money at the same time. If you go to the bank to withdraw your money, you can withdraw your money. That isn't a problem. The bank has enough for you to withdraw yours. What the bank can't handle is to have all of their depositors come in and try to withdraw all of their money. They don't keep that amount. After the October 1929 stock market crash, bank runs struck nationwide and hundreds of banks failed, including the enormous Bank of the United States. So these bank runs were a very serious problem. Now things are a little bit different today. Today, insurance from the federal government protects most people's deposits. If you watch TV, you may see commercials where you may hear the little disclaimers they run at the end, FDIC insured. And what that tells you is that bank, their deposits are insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is a government-owned corporation that exists for the purpose of insuring bank deposits. Currently, it insures bank deposits up to $250,000. Now, back at this point in time, they didn't cover bank deposits. The FDIC didn't exist. Now, we also experienced a lot of farm failures at this point in time. We looked at, in World War I, when we looked at World War I, we looked at how farmers began to try to increase food production to meet the needs of the war effort. Europe was decimated by war. And our farmers were ultimately stepping up and producing the food for the world. We were making what was needed to be exported to the foreign countries. We were selling to Europe as well as providing with our own troops and our people here at home. And so farmers increased their production. Now to do that, many farmers had to take out loans. They had to buy equipment. They had to purchase new land. All of these things cost money. So many farmers took out loans. And they did pretty well during the course of World War I. But as we saw in our unit on the 1920s, when World War I ended and Europe began to increase their food production, and all of a sudden, there was a competitive market for the United States. In other words, there were competitors in that market now competing with the United States for food production. American farmers began to struggle. So even while most of the nation was enjoying prosperity during the 1920s, our farmers were already hit hard, and things got worse with the Great Depression. The hard times that farmers faced got worse during the Depression when widespread joblessness and poverty cut down on the demand for food. We think food is an absolute necessity that people have to have, which it is. But if people don't have money, they can't buy it. Or if they can buy it, but they can't buy as much of it, they have to scale back and maybe go hungry more frequently. Well, many Americans did this during the course of the Depression. They just didn't have the money to really be able to meet their needs. And so many people simply ate less. And farmers sold less. The demand for farm products dropped off. By 1933, farmers were unable to sell food that they produced. Farm prices had sunk to 50% of their already low 1929 levels. Lower prices meant lower income for farmers, and many borrowed money from banks to pay for the land and equipment. Once again, all that increased production during the war. So they've got these loans, they've got to pay them back, and now they've got less revenue coming in. less income. How are they going to pay their bills? As incomes dropped, farmers couldn't pay back their loans. And in the first 5 years of the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of farms went bankrupt or suffered foreclosure. Now, foreclosure is something that may be familiar to many of you because we had the subprime housing crisis, which was the worst economic downturn in U.S. history since the Great Depression. And that hit in really 2008. Well, many people went into foreclosure during that time, having their homes foreclosed upon. And just the same way that a bank will foreclose, when a bank has loaned people money for a house, if they can't make their housing payment, the same way the bank will take over ownership and then auction it off, that's what was happening to farms. Farmers were losing their farms because they were being foreclosed upon and then sold to the highest bidder. The year following the crash of October 1929 saw a sharp drop in economic activity and a steep rise in unemployment. Such negative trends are not uncommon in times of economic downturn, but the extent and the duration of these trends made the Great Depression different. Even in the economic downturn, the worst recession since the Great Depression, our unemployment hit 10%, which was bad for sure. But that was the worst of it. During the Great Depression, it was much worse. By 1933, the gross national product had dropped over 40% from its pre-crash levels. Unemployment reached a staggering 25%. If you think about that, that means 1 in 4 people who were actively looking for work couldn't find it. Among some groups, the numbers were even higher. For example, in the African American neighborhood of Harlem, unemployment hit a staggering 50%, which meant that 1 out of every 2 people in Harlem were unable to find work during the Great Depression. The true measure of the Great Depression's disaster lies in how it affected the American people. And we start by looking at Hoovervilles. Thousands applied for a handful of jobs, and job loss resulted in poverty for most Americans. To survive, some people begged door to door, relied on soup kitchens and bread lines. Some went hungry. Some who lost their homes lived in shanty towns or Hoovervilles, which were named after President Hoover, who many people blamed for the Great Depression. During this point in time, many people began to blame the president, and this also isn't uncommon. During tough economic times, the president typically takes the blame. Even though the president can't single-handedly control the economy, there's generally a perception that it's the president's fault. And we will look later in the chapter at why Hoover was reluctant to take action to try to address the Great Depression and what action he did take and how America responded to that. But people blamed him. Many Americans blamed Hoover. They felt that he wasn't compassionate. He didn't care for the poor. Not only did people call these shanty towns Hoovervilles, but people were also known for pulling their pockets out of their pants, leaving their pockets hanging out to show that they were empty, and they called those Hoover flags. Clearly blaming their economic plight on President Hoover. And just so you know what a Hooverville actually is, or a shanty town, there are still shanty towns that exist in the world today on the outskirts of many major cities, especially in developing countries, particularly in Latin America. It's not uncommon to see these shanty towns that sprang up where people are living in tents or housing that's made out of whatever scrap material they can find. And people didn't necessarily have tents during the Great Depression, but people did build these, basically shacks out of whatever scrap material they could find around, whether it be pieces of boards or tin. They used whatever scrap material they could put together to create some type of a shelter. And similarly, even during this economic crisis that we had starting in 2008, people took action. People were stuck having to create makeshift housing. Up in Sacramento, there was kind of a famed area that became known as Tent City, where many people began to live in tents, where they had no running water, but people just began to congregate there and set up tents, and people were living out of tents. I mean, mass numbers of people living there. And that's kind of what things were like during the Great Depression. Many people had to live in these shanty towns, which they called Hoovervilles. And so that's what the Hooverville situation was. Also, there were hobos. Hobos were mostly men, but included teens and women as well. Boarding trains, which that's really what a hobo is basically somebody who rides the rails, somebody who's homeless and rides the rails. Boarding trains was hard and illegal, and railroads hired guards to chase hobos away. Finding food was a constant challenge because people had little to spare and rarely shared with hobos. Hobos developed a system of sign language to warn of possible dangers or opportunities. The greatest impact of the Great Depression was the emotional impact that it had on people. For many people, we were at a point in American culture, especially for many men, where the traditional family roles expected the man to be the provider, and the woman took care of the home. And that was just kind of the way that things were. But during the Great Depression, you had many men that couldn't find jobs, and their families were suffering. Whole families became homeless. And, for many men, even though many of them shared the same fate, the unemployed often felt that they had failed as people. It was a real blow to people's self-esteem. And accepting handouts deeply troubled many proud Americans. Their shame and despair was reflected in the high suicide rates of the time. Anger was another common emotion because many people felt that the nation had failed the hard-working citizens who had helped build it.